Hello, everybody, and welcome to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyun Park from Amalgam Insights, joined as always by Charlie Arajo. And somewhat for a change, we are both in rando places that are not our normal home spots. I am actually in San Diego right now at FinOps X, where there might be a little bit better background noise because they are actually having their opening party right outside my window. And Charlie,
Very
where are
nice.
you at?
I am in Bangalore, India, where it's 8 a.m. for me. So we're at opposite ends of the clock here, and trying to figure out a time to make all this work. So
Yep.
no parties going on at 8 a.m. here, but yeah, I went straight from vacation last week, so I appreciate you holding down the fort to jumping on a plane and heading over here. And I've been here all week, so yeah, it's been a little bit nuts.
Yeah. Wow. So, obviously we are busy working with clients and getting the lay of the land on a global basis. But be that as it may, there was also a few things that happened in the IT world last week. And so let's take a look at them. Uh, First up, last week, Databricks obviously had their Data and AI Summit, and they are an AI leader. They made a bunch of announcements ranging from their data warehousing capabilities to their ability to support models. But I think the one that really got my attention was around Shutterstock and Databricks' intention to bring more enterprise grade model capability for graphics and which we haven't really seen much of. We've seen a lot of work around model development and agent development, but really not so much around images yet. Uh, so I'm curious what you thought about that.
There are so many interesting aspects to this. First of all, I feel like we're watching like a literal war take place. With these skirmishes between Databricks and Snowflake, back and forth, and it's really, in the world of tech, there's always a sort of competitive partner angle where it's like there's overlapping spaces, but you rarely see this sort of direct head-to-head competition that these two are. So it's like really entertaining watching them sort of duke this out. I think it's also indicative of the sort of movement towards what I'll call cross-domain partnership. So, they announced a partnership with NVIDIA, but as we talked about before we got on air here, that everyone's partnering with NVIDIA. That there's nothing real surprising. But this partnership with Shutterstock is sort of more similar to the partnership that we talked about a month ago with ServiceNow and Genesis when they announced that partnership, where it's these partnerships that are focused on sort of a joint go-to-market. And I think this one is really interesting from that perspective. And then additionally, from the fact that this is very, very specifically focused on image generation for the enterprise. And the only one else that's really talking about that is Adobe. And they're getting into all kinds of hot water. And I'm not
Yeah.
convinced that Shutterfly is not going to get in hot water on this one, because the fourth aspect that was really interesting to me is that yes, they have a controlled data set and that they own that IP or control that IP, but that IP is actually jointly owned by the creators that submit to that and are supposed to get paid when someone downloads their content. And so, there was nothing in any of this press release that talked about if those creators were being compensated for that.
Right.
And what I found most shocking was that they didn't actually address it, given how much hot water Adobe, because Adobe made all this hay about it and then sort of got in hot water of it, why that wouldn't be a top of mind issue. So I think it's just really interesting all the way around. It speaks to the fact that this is an area that enterprises care about, they need, they're going to be looking at this. I think it's a great example of what Databricks can do and can help an organization, bring something to market. So just a lot of really interesting aspects to this.
Yeah, one of the interesting aspects about generative AI, I think in general, is how it is bringing up the issue around creators' rights, something that has been declining over the past couple of decades with the rise of Spotify and social media and all these assumptions that creators really just give up all of their ownership rights or can only get a tiny pittance of a fraction of a cent for each view or each listen associated with their content. And now everybody is pushing back a little bit and realizing that with AI, there might be an opportunity to rewrite the rules a little bit with this fundamentally new use of technology. But I think also from a pure graphic perspective, looking at the enterprise, there is a massive need to figure out how to create new and novel graphics, but yet reward the content creators and owners that have led to that new content. So this is hopefully a step in that direction. As you say, there are still IP issues for the original creators of all of this content, but at least this is better than, say, all of the efforts that we see on, I'll just call out OpenAI, that is just happy to drag in whatever they can and build models without really seeming to care about the initial creators at all.
Yeah, I think there's, and this is obviously a pervasive issue, and I think it plays on both sides. I mean, Perplexity has been in some recent hot water over their Pages technology, which Forbes just sued them about. They're saying they're scraping proprietary content and all of this. But there's also been some recent articles talking about how artists have sort of like looked at this more closely and are becoming a little less afraid, that they're realizing that Gen AI can replicate but really can't create new, and that's really what the drive of what an artist is supposed to be about. So I think I mean there's all these different factors. And I think, if you're an enterprise leader, obviously you're looking at this from the perspective of you can build this into workflows and that can speed productivity, and that's fabulous, right? I mean, as somebody who uses imagery with content, I spend 90% of that effort is searching, trying to find something that
Mhm.
represents what I'm trying to do. So the power of generative AI is I can just simply type what I'm looking for and it creates it, or finds it. And I think that is the interesting aspect of that from an enterprise perspective. But enterprises also need to be worried about the IP issue, right? I mean, every enterprise
Mhm.
is today mostly driven, or at least in part driven, by the proprietary nature of some of the content and IP that they generate. And Gen AI is a blunt force weapon, and so it will consume everything, and so every organization needs to be concerned about. So it's a really interesting dynamic. I don't, individually, this is not like a huge thing, but I think it's interesting because it's directionally indicative of sort of the some of the challenges that we're facing.
Mhm. Yeah, there's a lot of pressure on AI vendors to definitely talk about how to keep up with the Joneses, to be the latest and the greatest, to always push the boundaries. Obviously, everybody is pushing the boundaries right now, but I feel like at least last week, nobody pushed the boundaries more than our friends at Nice. With their contact center announcement. Their press release was definitely, I will say, very enthusiastic.
And oh, you're being very kind. The hyperbole was dripping off the page. It was sort of shocking, from a couple of standpoints. I mean, I've certainly been talking to everyone that I'm working with right now about being very, very concerned. I mean, what I find amazing about the CIOs 6 months ago were already getting AI fatigue. They were already getting, exhausted by being bombed by this, particularly when so much of it was not novel. It was just the same old stuff. And so what makes this one very challenging to me is, the headline. I will see if I have it up here. The headline was this, and I've lost it, but like the ultimate CX aware or
Yes.
something, and it was just like they're just pushing back out of this, and then you go read it, and there was really nothing that was truly dramatic in what they're doing, and so it ends up, in my opinion, having the opposite effect, of what they're really trying to convey. And I think, my if they were to ask me for my advice, the advice is start getting down to the reality of what this is. The big challenge for organizations right now isn't this whiz bang; it's about operationalization of it.
Mhm.
How do I actually put this into practice? And that, we've talked in the past about some of the organizations that are taking this much less sexy approach, and they're the ones that are going to be winning because they're focusing on the blocking and tackling, the brass tacks of how to execute on that. And it's not just the tech, but it's how you talk about it.
Yeah, and I'm sorry for picking on you, Nice, but like every paragraph I looked at this press release had something like saying this is the holy grail of AI, or we have created better guidance than the most expert of employees. There's just a level of hyperbole that is honestly not necessary at a time when everybody wants to use AI and everybody wants to align AI to enterprise use cases, but we need some level of functionality and guidance to get there. And frankly, NICE has been a best in breed contact center and engagement platform for some time now. Uh, it could have been a meteor press release. That's all I'm saying.
Well, and I think what I have trouble. There's two things I had trouble with. One is there is so much hype, hyperbole, buzzwords in it that I read a couple of these paragraphs like three times trying to figure out what this actually was. What, so it had the effect of obfuscating what they're trying to communicate.
Right.
And the second part of that was really unfortunate was that the piece of this that's really real, because a lot of what they're talking about is summarization and the normal stuff, but the piece of this that's actually real, something that I do believe is where things are going, and that is this ability to use a captive data set to create contextual awareness that actually makes the AI more useful. And
Mhm.
NICE does have a solid data set to work from, that if you are deploying this out, you've got this really, because they've got a comprehensive set of, across their platform, that they're getting more data than most of their competitors are doing. And so that contextual layer is actually valuable, but it got so lost in this release that you had to really work to kind of get to that part of it. And that was just unfortunate.
Yes. So just a note to all the vendors out there. Yes, you're going to do AI announcements and hopefully they'll be useful. Please focus on what your customers are actually trying to do from a work perspective as you are writing out these press releases.
Because there's real stuff, real issues, real things need to be addressed. We're
Mhm.
early stages. They just needed to go there. But it goes back to the point you were bringing it, that there is so much pressure around all of this to get out there and try to break through the noise and static, because everyone is talking about AI. And so I'm sympathetic to the challenge that they're
Mhm.
facing. But my advice to them and to any tech company is there's plenty of room if you focus on the practicality of it, and that's the way to break through rather than holy grail and all that other stuff,
Mhm.
because it is so challenging. Speaking of which, right, we also saw an announcement from Mistral that they raised another 600 million euro to go, to continue the development of what they're doing, and it sort of solidifies this point that this is hard stuff. It's expensive, particularly for those that are building at the foundational model piece, and it makes it tough. So, I mean, what was your take on this? I mean, did you take anything more about the? I mean, I'm almost a little surprised about we're still putting this much money into these companies at this stage.
Yeah, but honestly, the compute requires that. We're talking about 10 billion, 50 billion, 100 billion parameter models. And when you're talking about actually doing an LLM, you have to think about how those cross multiply from a matrix perspective, all the permutations associated with those parameters. And even if you don't have a degree in math, you can just imagine that a billion times a billion times a billion starts becoming a really big number when you have to put these things together. So you have to pay for all that compute to figure out all of those combinations from a testing perspective to get to these better models. And a lot of these tests won't work. So you have to pour just crazy amounts of money. But on the bright side, I feel like this is at least more productive than Bitcoin mining.
Well, the part, I mean, it's a lot. I mean, obviously it's expensive, and there's clearly a need for the big LLMs. What I'm struggling with from just a broad market perspective is we have OpenAI, we have Anthropic, we have X is Grok, we have Grok, whatever it's called. We have Facebook's or Meta's, I forgot what theirs is called
Llama,
now.
yeah.
Yeah, Llama. We have, so we already have these four, and I think I'm missing one.
We have
Um,
Cohere, which raised its own 240 million a couple weeks ago. Yeah.
so the question to me is, I'm a big believer that we're going to have a handful of these big LLMs that are sort of the foundational models. But the real future of this is in the small language models and the more practical application of this technology
Mhm.
in very targeted use cases. So I'm not saying that Mistral is not a good investment. I think we're going to see a shakeout in in the big LLMs because it's just not a sustainable amount of money. And what it really speaks to is how expensive this is to not only develop but then to operate. And that's really the issue. Why I think the LLMs themselves are going to, we're going to have some challenges with this because going back to what we just talked about, when you talk about operationalizing it, then that cost of inference becomes super super critical. I can't deploy this if my cost per transaction is too high, and so that's where I believe that either the small language models or other approaches that maybe aren't even based on this are going to start becoming more prominent because we've got to get the cost down. And so I saw this announcement and it was sort of like the juxtaposition. And I think we're going to end up with both, but I just don't think we're going to be able to support this many LLMs. And so I think that's going to end up shaking out.
Yeah, it's so tempting in tech to always think bigger is better, more is better. And right now, part of the reasons people are spending literally billions of dollars on these new models is because they feel like they have to throw 30, 50, 100 billion new words and tokens into the new model and figure out billions of new parameters. But I think there has to be a limit to how big something can be because there's only so many ways we can put together the English language or colors or whatever. There's a mathematical limit, and there's going to be a push to be more efficient. So you already mentioned small language models, but there are also some interesting academic approaches. We talked about the mixture of experts a few weeks ago, where you might have a bigger model but only access a small portion of it. That is specialized to your specific use case. And there's still some interesting primary research that is going into this as well. So, there's an interesting paper put out by UC Santa Cruz very recently, talking about how they are looking at changing some of the fundamental mathematical assumptions that are at the back end of the LLM to go basically from uh, matrix linear algebra to basic arithmetic as you're looking at changes. So you can just imagine the difference between going from a matrix to 1 plus 1 as you're trying to make changes. That's going to be a order of magnitude change in compute if they can get that to work for LLMs. So I think that's an interesting aspect as well, just that the foundational technology for LLMs still is not fully set. In fact, we're still just starting to figure out how to really optimize this stuff.
Yeah, I think it's we've talked about this before. Certainly, like Jan LeCun is proposing some non LLM based approaches altogether,
Mhm.
and I think it's easy to lose track of this. And I'm not, I don't think I know the technology well enough. It's way way beyond my pay grade to really know which way this is going to flesh out. So I look at it from that enterprise executive perspective, and that is that you need to be sort of hedging your bet, and you need to be very looking at this and demanding that organizations, both how you approach it, but the people you're partnering with are helping you manage that cost and not getting so swept up into this that you're sort of ignoring it and just saying like you have to go there. And so I think that it is interesting to see the approach. I'll tell you the other part that I thought was interesting about this one is that it was not coming from sort of the usual suspect. This came out from researchers at UC Santa Cruz, Soochow University, not sure where that is, and UC Davis.
Mhm.
And I thought, what that also speaks to is how, the rise of Gen AI has truly driven not only within industry, but within academia, a significant focus on these technologies.
Mhm.
And I think that's a good thing. I think we're going to see more development. We're going to see more novel architectures and approaches, either in this case where it's within the LLM and transformer sort of model or something completely different. So I think it's tempting to get sucked into all this and think, oh well, okay, this is it. This is the future. Now, where is this linear path going? And I think this is just a reminder that there are more unknown unknowns that we can
Yeah,
possibly get our head around.
like don't spend too much time optimizing on state-of-the-art June 2024 technology, because honestly, a lot of this will be obsolete in 2 years. We're gonna have a better way of doing all this 2 years from now, and I don't know what it is. It might be some academic technique that isn't even discovered till next year, that ends up
Yeah,
being dominant
exactly.
2 years from now. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the other part is that people forget that ChatGPT, when it was released by OpenAI, wasn't released as a commercial model. It was released as like an experiment. Oh, here, check this
Mhm.
out. This is what we're doing. And they were almost as surprised as anybody that this thing exploded the
Yeah.
way it did. And so I think it's going to be something similar. So, so yeah, I think I talk a lot about AI strategy, and I think when you're developing as an enterprise, if you're developing AI strategy, it's about allowing for all of that. It's about looking at the use cases, looking about what are the things that you think you can actually drive business value forward if you had access to various technologies or various ways, even if they don't exist yet, and start creating those pathways for those eventualities, because it's we're in such a state of change. You can't predict what it's going to be, and you shouldn't be making these linear plans based on what exists today, because it's going to change.
Mhm. But I do feel like
Speaking
the
of,
yeah. I just want to
no, no,
add
go.
one last bit about how this focus on LLMs. I worry about overtraining and creating a monoculture of AI, because this is a very specific approach to AI, and there are many other types of AI. But I feel like for the moment, it is providing a little bit of focus to research and product development, which has traditionally been missing from AI. Uh, we spent honestly a lot of the latter 2010s trying to optimize for AI as well. We saw a lot of data science platforms and machine learning capabilities, but it never really took off in the enterprise, partially because there were so many things to have to consider, and it was hard to figure out which direction to go in. LLMs at least give us a direction for figuring out what to productize with a UX that is approachable for the average human being.
Yeah, I mean, I think what LLMs really did do is it democratized this to the point where, or created a universal enough platform that it sort of got out of the lab. And I mean,
Yeah.
we obviously had production deployments of AI, but it was sort of this, the magic behind the curtain kind of thing. And so suddenly it became front and center, and that is, I think, has created a sort of eruption in all of this. And I agree. But going back to the point where I was going to go with this is that the trick as an enterprise leader is to not lose sight of the blocking and tackling that has to get
Mhm.
done, and that comes in a lot of forms. It comes in making sure you have an agile technology strategy that you can adapt and pivot. It also has to do with taking a hard look at how you're structured, about how you need to transform the roles of your internal teams. And I think for a lot of the legacy tech vendors that are selling the unsexy blocking and tackling sort of tech, this can be a difficult challenge in this area where we have folks like Nice, sucking up all the air in the room and trying to go, look at all this stuff.
Mhm.
And then you have people like storage vendors, as an example, that this is a critical foundational piece. When I talk all the time that AI is driven on two fundamental things: data and process, or data and workflows. And so these are the fundamental building blocks, and so many enterprises are still struggling with both of those. So you can have all the whiz bang AI tech on top of it, but if you don't have those foundations right, it's tough. And I think for a lot of folks doing that, they can struggle. So I think you were at NetApp, right, at their
Yeah.
event last week.
Their analyst summit last week, and it was an interesting perspective, because I totally agree. I think about AI, I think a lot about model development and compute. That gets a lot of the attention, but storage and networking still matter as well. And NetApp made an interesting couple of points. They talk about their intelligent data infrastructure as what they support from a storage perspective. From a practical perspective, that means file storage, block storage for your data lakes, as well as flash storage for more performance stuff, and using those as necessary to build out your AI and analytic storage. So that part made sense to me. And they also showed this interesting slide, which will pop up here, uh, which shows 6 key use cases associated with storage, which I found extremely and surprisingly practical, because storage vendors tend to talk about just pure speeds and feeds and gigabytes and petabytes and et cetera, associated with what they support. And I found this slide here to be quite useful in providing a more departmental and human perspective of what the storage actually means to people.
Well, and what I like about it is I would, I mean, I guess it's use cases, but it's really speaking very pragmatically to this class of IT professional who clearly in this slide, I think is the proof of it, is struggling to remain relevant with all of this hype. And
Hmm.
so this slide is really their way of saying this is how you be relevant in these conversations. And I think it's critical because it's really easy to lose sight, as we talked about, of these really critical foundational components. So I talked about, be the silo buster, right? Be the budget hero, be the sustainability champion, be the application agility driver, right? These are ways that what they're basically saying is our technology, if you can leverage it properly, is relevant to these conversations that are going on. That it's really easy to simply dismiss and say, "Oh, storage doesn't matter, network doesn't matter, even compute, maybe doesn't matter because it's just commoditized." And so this sort of approach, and I think it's an object lesson or a great model for any tech company that is delivering this sort of foundational technology and trying to not only be relevant themselves, but I think what I love about what NetApp is doing is recognizing that it's not just about them being relevant, it's about helping their primary consumer be relevant in these conversations within the IT organization. And I think it was a brilliant move.
Yeah. So I found that to be interesting. And then they were also uh, providing examples of how they align each of their products to these specific use cases, which is, I think, exactly the type of mapping that customers need as they are trying to sell up to their executive stakeholders and trying to find the right champion. At least they're able to share this language. And I wouldn't say this is the most complex language, but it provides a basic lingua franca, basic standard language that your average techie can provide a one or two levels up from a managerial perspective. And it's honestly something that every vendor should be doing because
Exactly.
it's easy to get stuck and say and commoditized when everybody's just thinking about these billion-dollar models that we've just been talking about. And that's the flash and dash, but you're still going to need all the foundational technology to support the flash and dash at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, I actually, the fact that it's, what did you say, not very complex language or whatever, I think that's its beauty. It's that this is very pragmatic, very simple terms, and it speaks to the specific challenges that the organization is facing, the conversations they're having, and it gives, if you're a data engineer, a data architect, it gives you a place to, or responsible for the data infrastructure, I guess I should say, that it gives
Mhm.
you a place to play, and that's absolutely critical. So yeah, no, I thought it was really really brilliant, and it also goes back to this idea of I think the folks are going to win, and not to keep picking on nice, right? But if I look at the spectrum of how organizations go to market with their AI, we're seeing this across the spectrum, and those that are focusing on the hyperbole and the oh my gosh, it's the greatest new thing ever, are, I think, in the end going to lose out unless you are truly delivering a completely breakthrough technology, and the reality is most are not. Then the ones that are going to win are the ones that are on the other end of that spectrum, which are focusing on the practicality, how to actually put this into operation, how to make this something that applies and can actually start changing my business in very real, tangible, practical, measurable ways. And I think that we saw a couple of announcements this week that are sort of leaning into that.
Mhm.
The first was this was an announcement just 2 days ago from WalkMe. They introduced something called WalkMe X, and I'm probably a little skeptical, as you know. I think you talked about it last week. They were just acquired by SAP, and
Yeah.
that to me is always a danger sign when these large companies acquires a smaller innovative company. And so we'll see where that plays out. They're obviously working on this before the acquisition, but this is meant to be a universal co-pilot that, using the WalkMe technology, sort of creates this contextual awareness, of what they're claiming, contextual awareness across any workload, any app. I think that's a very difficult thing to do, so I'm not sure that they're going to live up to that. But the most important part of this was that it's proactive, or it has this proactive element where it's monitoring this. And then instead of waiting for you to prompt, go into a Copilot and ask it a question, it says, you proactively says, hey, here's a situation, here's an issue that maybe you should be looking at, right? And so that sort of proactive piece of this. The other announcement came out of Asana, that was a week before, and they're announcing this thing that they're calling AI teammates. So they're expressly not
Hmm.
positioning them as fully autonomous agents or as a co-pilot, but this thing that sort of sits in the middle that can also act proactively like someone who's on your team might do. It's like, oh, hey, we got this thing. You should take a look at this, and this interaction. And this goes back to the conversation we had a couple weeks ago about the fact that as humans, we don't really want something, or we may not want something operating fully autonomously outside of our purview. We want to have some degree of control, but we also want higher levels of automation. And I think that's where some of the co-pilot approaches may struggle, because if it's always there and it always requires me to drive the conversation, then I may miss something because I don't know to ask for it. And so these are a couple of moves towards this idea of driving both contextual awareness and in a proactive type approach to sort of bridge that gap. And I think
Hmm.
we're going to see more of this. And I think it's smart. I think you have to be able to deliver. So it's, I think WalkMe also had some of the hyperbole challenges. You have to be able to deliver, but I think it's the approach that is going to be prevalent as we go forward.
Yeah, what I like about the WalkMe X announcement is that WalkMe provides this step-by-step guide of how to use an application. So I see that documentation uh, and conversation aspect of WalkMe X as an extension. It actually is organic to where they would probably go even if LLMs didn't exist. Except it would have been so much harder. So I feel like there's at least an organic extension that exists there that doesn't always exist with a lot of companies that are just AI washing their solutions and adding an LLM and leaving users to try to figure out what to do next. Here, there's this direction from providing guidance on how to use the application and then moving from that to a deeper documentation and conversation there. I have to admit, I'm a little more worried about the Asana teammate, at least positioning. I honestly feel that a lot of these LLM agents and capabilities are best described as something like contextualizers or providing some sort of framework that is in line with the business. But of course, that's not very fun to say. So we have to find things like teammates and partners and buddies and co-pilots and what have you to try to personalize it a little bit and anthropomorphize it to help
Yeah,
help you buy it.
I do think it's, I think we're going to see this battle play out of striking the right balance. All right. At the end of the day, all of these are approaches that are related to the agentic AI
Mhm.
motion about having much more autonomy in the actions, and that it's not just this purely reactive sort of thing. And I think that there's no question that that's going to be where this lands. But I think there's going to be this continual fight in nomenclature, terminology, how we position it, to figure out what people will accept. And the idea here is sort of similar to having like a chat bot that is embedded into Teams or Slack, right? Where it's sitting there and you can send it something and it acts on it and then brings it back to you, much like you would a person, right? I send something to you, say, hey, can you look at this and get back to me? And then a day later you send it back to me. Well, that's the idea that they're trying to convey, that it's not just this chat that's sitting there that can actually perform actions for you, but not where it's just like, Skynet running off doing its own thing where you have no
Mhm.
control. And that's what they're trying to convey. And I think it's smart insofar as I think that's ultimately the model that most of us want.
Yep.
But it's how we message that, how we position that, and then how we execute on it. Right. I mean, going back to the WalkMe thing, I think their limit is, they're fundamentally driven by a website injection, right? That's how they're really contextualizing, and that gives there's a limit to that. And so, can they execute? Can they deliver on their promise? I think that's going to be the question. I also think what WalkMe's, and to a certain degree Asana's as well, announcement also speak to, in addition to this proactive and contextualization, it's also this idea of a pervasive connection, right? So, we've talked in the past about Microsoft having 130 co-pilots and all of this, and I think that we're going to have the saturation point where I don't want to have to deal with how many different AI agents do I have floating around all over the place. I already personally use 4 every day, and it's already sort of too much. And
Mhm.
and so I think WalkMe is on the right track of saying, hey, this is the AI agent to rule them all that kind of sits over it again if they can deliver on it. So I think we're going to see that movement play out as well. Um, but it just going all the way back to what we were talking about. I think as an enterprise leader, you just have the stuff is changing so flippin'
Mm.
fast, and trying to figure out where to place your bets. Really, the root of it always has to be starting with what are the things that are going to move your organization forward, and where can you leverage any of these technologies to help you do that? And that's where you have to focus, because otherwise you just get swept up in all of it.
Yeah, and I think this is a rubber meets the road moment for a bunch of these future of work vendors. I would include Asana in that, but also probably Slack, ServiceNow. Some of these companies that have been talking the talk for the past 5 years ago or so about how they are going to transform the workplace. They got a starting point during COVID when we had the great experiment of trying to figure out how to work remotely. But with the combination of hybrid work and now LLMs, I think this is a real turning point to figure out who really was thinking about the future of work and how to fundamentally do things differently, because now we have a bunch of tools to do things differently, and this is the time to actually reimagine and create a better workplace, or show that you were just creating a bunch of interesting flashy features the past few years.
No doubt. I think it's a good way of saying it. I think the next 12 to 24 months, if you're an enterprise IT leader, it is going to be about how do you make this practical. And simply, as much as I'm broadly bullish on what Microsoft is doing, simply deploying a Teams Copilot isn't going to cut it, right?
Yep.
It is not going to be enough to really demonstrate that you're leveraging this technology in novel ways to create competitive advantage for the organization, and that's ultimately going to be the only thing that really matters in some way. And so I think that it is that we're rapidly reaching, we'll call it the first rubber meets the road kind of period. I think, as we talked about, it's going to continue changing and evolving, but we've been at this now for what, a year and a half, and it's time that organizations have to start being, demonstrating some practical value out of it.
Right, because if Accenture is talking about the $4 trillion of GDP that's going to be created from AI, honestly, we are not there right now. To get from here to there, some sort of fundamental change has to happen. And honestly, I think that even without reaching 4 trillion or even 1 trillion, like we are changing the way work is happening, but the actual value needs to start showing up in actual profits and revenues and bottom line.
Amen. I think it's a
Mhm.
good place to wrap that up.
All right. And with that, thank you for joining us for yet another week of This Week in Enterprise Tech. Charlie, thank you for so much for joining us from Bangalore. Um, Good luck with the rest of your client visit, and uh, keep helping companies to transform.
All right, same for you. All right, travel safe. See you, everybody.
Take care.